Hi, I'm Teresa Martin from Lower Cape TV and your host for The Minds of Summer, produced in partnership with the Cape Cod Institute, which brings leading thinkers and doers from around the world to its renowned week-long workshops right here on the Outer Cape. We once believed that the human brain couldn't change. As that old saw says, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But the past 2 decades or so of research tell us a very different story. Our biological brains can indeed stretch and adapt and change throughout our lives. And that means change is always possible. With us today is Linda Graham, author of Bouncing Back, Rewiring Your Brain for Maximum Resilience and Well-Being. Her book focuses on the emerging area of integration between neuroscience, psychology, and mindfulness. Welcome, Linda. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Now, you call the brain a social learning organ, which is a somewhat different way to think of the brain than what some of us once learned in our old biology classes, right? Can you talk a little bit more about what that means and how you see the brain?
So this comes from Dan Siegel's idea of interpersonal neurobiology, that the brain's development and maturation is actually kindled in relationship with other people. Early on, that's how the brain develops. As we mature and grow lifelong, the brain learns best in interactions with other brains. So when we're interacting with people who are resonant and resilient, then it's more likely we can become that way also.
So that we tend to learn from other people, not necessarily from things in our environment.
We tend to learn from experience. The brain changes by experience. And when we choose the experiences that will rewire the brain in a direction that's more resilient and well-being, we're actually choosing to use that capacity of the brain to change itself lifelong, to create new patterns, new responses, new coping strategies.
One of the reviews of your book says that you teach us how to shape our brains to be more like bamboo, which bends and rebounds in the wind. I love that image of bamboo swaying and our brains doing something like that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So one of the keys to resilience is response flexibility, being able to shift gears, shift perspective, shift our behaviors as the situation arises. And as I teach in my workshops, Charles Darwin said, "It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the one that is the most intelligent. Rather, it is the one most adaptive to change." So the more comfortable we can become with changing and responding to changes in our lives, the more resilient we'll be.
And that's something we know for sure about life, is that something's going to change all the time, right?
It's part of the human condition that we face disappointments and difficulties and even disasters as part of our human condition. So to be able to respond to those events in ways that are skillful and adaptive and flexible is how we can bounce back from the terrible, from the difficult, and actually even grow because of the experience.
And we can actually learn how to do this? We can actually rewire our brain?
So one of the benefits of neuroscience, as it's informing the kinds of tools and exercises and techniques that we can use to change the brain in a wise and wholesome direction, we're learning what tools to draw from psychology and from contemplative practice that will actually change the brain in a more resilient and wholesome direction.
So this actually really biologically changes your brain too?
We can create new neural circuitry and pathways. We can reorganize the circuitry and pathways that we already have. And we can even use tools of memory deconsolidation, reconsolidation, to rewire traumatic patterns that we use in response to trauma.
So how do we know this actually works? This is fairly recent research, right?
So the scientists have had the technology in the last 20 years that allows them to peek inside the black box of the brain and see what structures of the brain light up and talk to each other as we do real events in real time. So if we're playing music or walking the dog or watching news on TV, they can see what parts of the brain are involved in those activities. So as we learn that, we can learn how to change the automatic, unconscious, implicit memory patterns that we have how to come out of our survival responses and reactivity, and actually choose new experiences with people or our inner visualizations, our inner meditations, to rewire the brain.
So, one has always read about, how meditation can change how you perceive or react to something, but it really does change.
The scientists are learning that mindfulness and compassion practice are two of the most powerful agents of brain change known to science. So when we choose to do a mindfulness practice or a self-compassion practice, we're actually shifting the functioning of the brain in that moment. Over time, we can create new patterns of response.
How does that tie into resiliency?
So the more flexible, we want to be stable in our functioning, but the more flexible we can be in meeting the challenges of life, the more options we have, and the more options we have, the more resilient we can be.
When you hear resiliency, I picture like a big event that you need to be able to respond to, I don't know, your house burning down or your hard drive crashing or something. But what kind of levels of responses are you talking about?
So actually the brain learns best with little and often experiences, small events repeated many times. So the brain changes its neural circuitry through repetition. So we practice through mindfulness, through compassion practice, through communicating with other people, a gratitude practice, focusing our attention. We practice in the small ways, so when the big things happen, we can actually open up to a new response without even having to think about it. We become more flexible without even having to think about it.
Because we've practiced
baby
steps.
That's right. That's right.
I understand the brain is actually multiple different parts working together, and different practices do different things.
There are many different structures of the brain that have to interact. I call one structure of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the CEO of resilience, because it is what
I like that phrase.
it's what manages and monitors many of the activities of the brain and integrates various parts of the brain working together. Our top-down conscious cortical structures, and then the bottom-up lower brain unconscious structures. The right and left hemisphere of the brain, so we can integrate our feelings with our thoughts, integrating a sense of past, present, and future. So when we can strengthen the functioning of that prefrontal cortex, then we're actually more integrated and adaptive in our responses. And a lot of the exercises that I offer in the book are specifically to strengthen the prefrontal cortex.
That's interesting, because there's so many things going on at the same time. It's kind of amazing we all manage to function in the world. I mean, we feel things, we logically respond to things, we have almost instinct things, and somehow it all works.
So the scientists know that the brain is the most complex entity in the entire universe. 100 trillion cells, 100 billion cells with trillions of synaptic connections. And they say that there are more connections among the neurons in a single cubic centimeter of brain tissue than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy.
Wow.
Wow. So to contemplate the brain literally boggles the mind. So as we learn how to harness the power of the brain to rewire and change itself, then we can move from any stress and trauma and difficulty that we're experiencing to more stability and flexibility, to actually moving into thriving and flourishing.
That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, it sounds almost science fiction, but people have known this for thousands of years on some level, haven't they?
There's a lot of intuitive wisdom about what makes up for a good life. There's been a lot of study in terms of mindfulness practice for thousands of years to study how the mind works and how we can disengage from the entanglements of the mind, our worry and our rumination. But the science is so new. It's validating a lot of what we've known, but it also opens up new possibilities, new territory. So for instance, the whole positive psychology movement is also about 20 years old. But the melding together of the behavioral science research and the neuroscience research is showing the positive impact of positive emotions, not just on our behavior, but also on the brain itself.
Wow. How are people accepting that? Because, the last industrial era has all been about sort of the science, turning everything into science and everything needing to be empirical. And it must be very, I mean, I wonder how our brains rewire as we take these two seemingly different areas and realize that they're part of the same whole.
I'm finding, I'm a psychotherapist, and I'm finding that my clients really enjoy learning how their brain works. Not only can they make the changes that they want to make in their lives, be less reactive, less angry, less depressed, but it gives them a sense of mastery and a sense of competency to think that they actually can choose to create the changes that they want in their lives. And so people become more resilient and more happy campers just from knowing that.
Right, it's almost empowering to know I'm not controlled by what's sloshing around me, that I have the ability to really control, not just the will, but I really have that ability.
So what the neuroscience is informing us is how to help people move from being a victim me, I'm at the effect of things happening to me, to an empowered agentic I. I can choose, I can make things happen, and the choices I make can have an impact. So that's a tremendous sense of freedom and liberation for people. It's a sense of responsibility as well, but it's a sense of liberation and freedom that they can make choices that will make their life better.
Wow. In your book, you write about a number of C's, right? The C's of coping. And we were just talking about, there's 6 of them. Calm, compassion, clarity, connections, competence, and courage. So what do this basket of C's have to do with the biological brain and resiliency?
So the C's follow sort of a trajectory. The brain needs to be in a state of equilibrium, in a state of equanimity, to be open to learning, to be open to change. So anything that we can do to calm down the body brain and bring us back into a sense of equilibrium opens the brain to learning. So I teach calm first. Sometimes as we're opening to learning, we need compassion for the difficulties we're in, or our own reactivity, or how hard it is sometimes to live life. So I teach exercises in self-compassion to shift the functioning of the brain from our survival responses to more openness. The clarity is the mindfulness practices that allow us to look and see without judgment, without resistance. The connections are connections to resources, because we never do this all alone. And we can connect to practices and to places as resources, but I especially teach how to connect to people. And that's important because we're hardwired by our evolution, it's our biology, to seek help from other people, to seek resourcing from other people.
What you were saying just a little bit ago, that our brains develop by interacting with other brains.
Exactly. But sometimes we have experiences in relationship that have been neglectful or critical or abusive or toxic, and so not everybody has a trust in the power of relationships to be healing and growing. So I teach a lot of tools to help people come back into a sense of trusting themselves, retiring the inner critic, opening to help from other people, and being able to use people as a resource. We regulate our own nervous system all the time by being in the company of people that are safe and trustworthy. So we need to be able to learn how to resource with people. That will lead to a sense of competence as we're more able to work with our own brains to create the changes in our behaviors that we want. And then that gives us the courage to try new things and do new things and move the resilience beyond our personal self. We can be out engaged in the world and making the world a better place as well.
So biologically, I mean, I love how this fits. I mean, I like how these pieces fit. I don't mean to come back to it, but to me it's fascinating how the two sides come together. That if you're in biologically a calm state, and you're not beating yourself up, and you're not looking to flee from the saber-toothed tiger, that's a place where our brains can literally work on rewiring themselves.
More easily. The learning will happen more easily when the brain is open and when it feels safe.
So trying to rethink how you respond to your spouse while you're running from the saber-toothed tiger is not the best time to do that.
Not the best time. Certainly our brains operate very quickly on instinct, but those options are much more limited. The higher brain, the cortex, the conscious part of our brain, is much slower in its processing information and experience, but it's much more comprehensive. We have many, many more choices. So we want to be able to use the information coming from the lower brain if we're in danger, or if we're lonely, or if we're joyful. We want to use the information coming from our body, but then we manage that and channel that with our higher brain.
again, all those different pieces working together in those more connections than the Milky Way has stars.
Right.
The complexity is it's incredible.
Yeah.
So we talked some about that you can intentionally learn this. This to me is you know, I'm old enough that I grew up when you learned your brain didn't change, and that anything you wanted to change was a sort of a bad habit. It was a matter of sort of some kind of moral goodness or badness if you could change or not. And it's interesting because it takes that whole construct and says there's another whole basis for it.
It's important to realize that we learn our patterns of responding to life events early on from the people around us who are caregiving in our attachment relationships. And those patterns will be established in the brain pretty solidly by 18 months of age. That's before there's any conscious processing. As the brain matures and becomes more conscious, then we can have choices. We're operating about 80% of the time out of our implicit, unconscious, automatic conditioned patterns. We can use our conscious processing when we want to change them. And we have to learn how to light up the networks of those memories so that we can actually change them. And that's what all these tools and techniques are for.
So tell me about some of these tools and techniques. And I mean, are they hard? Do they take a lot of training?
They take practice and they take perseverance. Okay, the tools themselves can be very simple, but the brain learns by repetition. It is. They say that any experience will cause neurons in the brain to fire. If you repeat the experience, you're repeating the neural firings. Neurons that fire together wire together. That's how you create the circuitry and pathways. So the more you repeat an experience, the more likely you are that the brain will go in that same direction again.
That's when babies learn, it's hot, it's hot. You know, they'll do it a few times and then they'll finally realize, oh, if it's glowing red, it's hot. But it's not the first time that they learn it.
Right. So we repeat these exercises so the brain actually has a chance to create the new circuitry and install it in long-term memory. So one of the exercises that I usually teach first on is called hand on the heart. Can we do that? Okay.
Absolutely. Okay, so what do I do?
So you simply place your own hand on your own heart center. So you feel the warm touch of your hand on your heart center. And then you begin to breathe slowly and deeply into your heart center. And if you wish, you can breathe a sense of ease or goodness or safety or trust into your heart center. Then you take a moment to remember a moment when you felt safe and loved and cherished with another human being. Not the whole relationship, just one moment. And it could be a partner or a child or a friend or a therapist. It could be a spiritual figure, it could be a pet. And you remember that moment of feeling safe and loved and cherished, and you let the glow of that memory kind of wash through your body. And you just stay there for a few seconds and sort of savoring the sense of peace and calm that you can come into. And what's happening in the brain as we do that is the deep breathing will activate the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system, so that's calming us down. Breathing in a sense of ease or goodness or positive emotion restores the heart rate variability, so the heart is more able to respond to signals from the body. But the important part of that is remembering this moment of feeling safe and loved and cherished with another person. The warm touch of your hand on your heart will help, but the memory will activate the release of oxytocin, which is the hormone of safety and trust, of bonding and belonging, of calm and connect. And that's what we experience when we are physically touching or physically close to or remembering or even imagining someone where we feel safe and loved. But oxytocin is the brain's direct and immediate antidote to the stress hormone cortisol. So when we feel safe with another person, our blood pressure goes down, the heart rate variability restores, and we can actually come into a sense of calm from which we can respond more flexibly. So this technique, hand on the heart, is powerful enough to calm down a panic attack in less than a minute. So it's one of the first things that I teach my clients, because they're learning how to use their brain to regulate their nervous system so they can be more resilient.
That's fascinating. So you draw on a memory, and it isn't even, is it the literal memory or the feeling that comes with the memory that you're drawing on?
You have the memory so that you can evoke the feeling. One of the things that we do know about the brain and why visualizations are so important, so powerful, when we imagine something, the same neurons fire in the visual cortex as when we're seeing that something in real time. So if you imagine a banana, the same neurons fire in your cortex as if you're seeing a banana in real time. So when you're doing a guided visualization and remembering being with someone where you felt safe, and then you evoke that feeling again in your body, you have the somatic memory of it, you can release the oxytocin.
Just from
memory.
Do all of our senses have that kind of response, or is it our visuals? Like I'm thinking, people say that distant memory is tied into scent a lot. You smell cinnamon and you remember the cinnamon toast you had on the rainy day when you were 5 years old.
Right. So because our olfactory nerve communicates directly to the brain, which is why those memories can be so powerful. We do a lot of our processing through the visual cortex. It takes up almost 1/3 of the brain. So human beings are very oriented toward visual. But anytime we can remember a movement, an emotion, something from our sensory input, it can evoke a very powerful sense of that memory. And because those memories are located more in the lower brain, we actually can do the rewiring at a deeper level in the brain. We're not just thinking, oh, I should behave differently.
Right.
We're actually rewiring the patterns that cause our behavior.
And that kind of brings us back to those 6 C's again, that when we do the hand on the heart, that brings the brain to a calm state. And once it's in that calm state, these various chemical activities are better able to take over. Am I saying that right?
We're better able to channel the chemical activities in the direction that we want.
Okay.
So we're beginning to understand the power of the neurotransmitters to change our mood and to change our behavior. And that's part of what I try to teach, is the exercises that will evoke or strengthen this or that neurotransmitter so we can send our behavior in the direction we want.
Does this work for anybody, or do you have to, I don't know, have a preconceived interest in change? I mean, I'm being a cynic here for a second, okay? Because I felt that. It felt very powerful. I mean, I could feel the heat of my hand. I could, it did bring me to a calmer spot. And some people would, kind of say, well, yeah, I don't know.
So there's a couple of things. One, if there's organic impairment in the brain, if there's a traumatic brain injury, then that's a different ballgame in many ways, because the brain is going to be operating differently. But when there's just a naturally functioning brain, usually the problem is resistance or reluctance to try something new. We have to have the willingness to try something new. So I offer everything as an experiment. We'll try something small, see what happens. If it works, we'll do it again.
Right.
If it doesn't, we won't. So that there's a sense of safety and trust to try something new. And that's how the brain will learn, is when we're willing to try something new. Yeah. So it's available to anyone who's willing to say yes.
And give it a try.
Right.
Again, I just love how these pieces fit together.
All the pieces fit together.
The brain is truly amazing.
And what that prefrontal cortex does is it integrates all the pieces. When that part of our brain is functioning well, then we have a more whole, integrated sense of self that's functioning. We're not split off into separate compartments that don't talk to each other.
I see as you're talking, I'm getting these. You remember those science films you had when you were a little kid, the sort of Disney science films? You had like the brain, and the 3 little pieces of the brain would talk to each other to show how it functions. So I'm getting these images.
So now someone in the class this morning recommended the Pixar film Inside Out.
Oh, yes.
Because it's really graphically portraying how the different emotions within the brain have to work together for us to be a whole, authentic person. It's really quite brilliant.
And even that our emotions are indeed part of biology, that to me is
Emotions
incredible.
Are one of the most important parts of our biology, that we make our decisions based on our emotional intelligence more often than we do on our rational thinking. So if we know that and can learn how to work with our emotions skillfully, so we're not scared of them, we're not repressing them, we're not running away, then we have that intelligence available to inform us of how to relate to people and how to be more resilient.
Now, is there, like a process? I think I remember you writing about a process of kind of moving through.
There are practices that will accelerate this brain change. One is coming into a sense of presence. So we come out of distraction, out of denial, out of dissociation. We show up, we engage.
All those things we were just talking about, I don't think it'll work. You kind of put that aside.
Right, you come into the present moment so that the brain is primed to learn something. And then you set an intention, which is the willingness to experiment. And then that activates the plasticity of the brain. And then you have to practice, you have to repeat, you have to do things again and again and again so the brain will create the new pathway. So you're persevering so it gets installed into long-term memory. Eventually it becomes a new unconscious automatic habit and you don't have to think about it anymore. Many times my clients will automatically do hand on the heart.
I was just going to ask that because I'm thinking, you put yourself in the present.
Right.
You accept that you're going to change, and then you keep doing it often enough that it becomes...
It's a new response to, if there's something that startles the nervous system, that becomes the new automatic response of calming yourself down so that you can think straight again.
Right, instead of gasping for breath or twitching or
right.
Doing some other behavior that doesn't help you be resilient.
Right.
Because it all comes back to resiliency, right?
We're learning the behaviors that help us be more resilient because sometimes the behaviors we learned early on are not so functional, they're not so adaptive, and we'll do them automatically until we teach our brain to do something else. So we're learning how to teach our brain to do something else.
I just think of all the small daily things that people encounter, and some people just sort of seem to roll with the punches, and some, you want to say, are you 3 years old still? Because the door opened instead of closed, that doesn't mean you scream. Maybe you did that when you were 3, but
So two things. Stress rolls off us more easily when we already have the oxytocin flowing through our system, when we already feel safe in this world. The stress doesn't trigger our automatic survival responses so much. But if we're still reacting like we did when we were 3, then we have an implicit somatic body memory somewhere. And that we can also bring to consciousness and learn to rewire. So we have a different response when the door slams.
Right, we don't scream because we're afraid.
We know that we don't have to, we're safe now. That happened back then, but we're safe now.
Right, and we're literally wired. I mean, there's literally a biological wiring that may have happened when we were 3 that said, door slam, scream.
Right, and we can redo that wiring.
I just, I picture all the times that you hear people tell other people, well, just do it different. That with that sense of impatience that if you just wanted it more, you would do it different.
Well, actually, we're learning a lot that self-criticism or judgment like that doesn't help the brain change. It shuts it down. More workable is to be self-compassionate, self-accepting, self-appreciating. That keeps the brain open, safe, and willing to learn. So rather than wagging the finger at somebody else or even at ourselves, to have understanding and acceptance and compassion and forgiveness, and then just come into the present moment and be willing to make an experiment.
That present moment strikes me a lot of, and that mindfulness is all about being in the present.
Right.
But there's a science of being in the present.
The practice of being in the present moment is now validated by science for the changes that it creates in the brain. So we can practice being present and experience the benefit of it, but sometimes knowing the science behind that gives us a little extra conviction that this is worth persevering in.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. And I'm Teresa Martin from Lower Cape TV. Linda Graham has been with me today talking about creating a resilient brain and knowing that we have the power in ourselves to change the way we respond and react. Thank you very much. This has been terrific.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it immensely.